Again, welcome to the 2013 Distinguished Lecture of the General Anthropology Division. We're extremely pleased to have Professor Bruno Latour as this year's Distinguished Lecturer. Bruno Latour has been at Sciences Po Paris since 2007, first serving 5 years as Vice President of Research before returning to the faculty as Professor. Latour's work is as expansive as it is influential, crossing disciplinary boundaries from science and technology studies to anthropology and archaeology, religion, architecture, and environmental studies. As readily as humans and objects, Latour connects into large agential networks in his actor network theory, or ANT. Professor Latour's research began with his doctoral work on, of all things, biblical exegesis. He then moved to studies of science that brought ethnography into scientific laboratory, leading to his books Laboratory Life, which he co-authored with Steve Woolgar, and The Pasteurization of France, and the widely influential book Science in Action. Not satisfied with actor networks theory as it stood at the time, and the social turn of which ANT was a significant contributor in science and technology studies, Latour remade ANT in Reassembling the Social, arguing that the social and society represented the same kind of black boxes in the social sciences that the social turn in STS would attack in the realm of technoscience. Latour proposed that society entails a concrete set of relationships that are reassembled in particular ways that vary across contexts like law, religion, and science. What links Professor Latour's studies of religion and science, perhaps, is his ongoing interest in regimes of truth, which led to his reworking of ANT in Reassembling the Social, and to his studies of modernity in his book, We Have Never Been Modern, that challenges the reality of modern dichotomies that separate nature from culture and humans from objects. And his most recent volume, An Inquiry into Modes of Existence, which is part of another session that Professor Latour will be participating in tomorrow afternoon in this room as well, here at AAA. And so it's my pleasure to introduce the 2013 General Anthropology Division's Distinguished Lecturer, Bruno Latour, speaking on what is a recommended dose of ontological pluralism for a safe anthropological diplomacy. Bruno?
I think you would agree that such a razor, if it were to be used too intensely, would gravely deplete the resource that anthropologists are allowed to use to account for the multiplicity of agencies entertained by the collective with which you came into contact. This depletion would be especially troubling when it's those who call themselves modern, whose strange ways of life have to be documented through the use of ethnographic methods. Modern collective seems to have a difficulty reconciling the official principle of parsimony, the world is made of object and subject, period, with the bewildering numbers of entities they have never ceased to encounter or to generate along their path. This is why I propose to shift slightly the metaphor of a razor. Instead of using it to shave off any excess of entities proliferating needlessly everywhere, I want to take it rather as a nice stainless cutlery set, une batterie de cuisine, such as a good chef needs to have in front of her in order to delicately dispose of her vegetable, meat, herb, and condiments, and especially to dispatch her chickens, as Plato would advise her to do, without breaking their subtle articulation. If you can show me a chef that employs only 2 knives and 1 single pot to prepare every 4-star dish, then I would fall back on the older metaphor of a razor. In the meantime, I will strictly apply the principle of parsimony by proposing to use exactly as many tools as necessary to delineate as exactly as possible what should not be disarticulated. Not one more, I agree, but not one less either. Such a shift of connotation of the metaphor of a razor will allow me to nudge the notion of ontology away from its excessively grandiose pedigree. Even though ontology has been defined as the science of being as being, and here you may want to overhear the loud organs of German philosophical requiem played at full volume, I take it as a relational and highly practical term. Ontology is what you engage in whenever you wish not to shock those you are encountering by granting the wrong type of reality to the agencies that keep them moving. In that sense, ontology is close to the term of diplomacy. As every ethnographer knows, in addition to the many blunders every one of us commits in the course of his or her fieldwork, there exist also graver mistakes where you sense that the regime of reality granted to this or that entity has been seriously mistaken. It's at those points, usually the most revealing moment in the course of our inquiries, when we try to repair broken relations by some innovative move into defining the status of a contrasting realities that have been open to misinterpretation. I lived through that myself when I first noticed 40 years ago that there was absolutely no way that I could capture laboratory life with the pincer of realism versus social constructivism. Every use of this crude tool created such an uproar that I had to work ever since to begin to sketch the status of artificially produced objective fact. And the topic is still so touchy, but I'm not sure I've succeeded. Anyway, it's through such innovation that we are practicing ontology. When we realize that we had entered the interaction with too limited a set of templates to account for the degrees of realities mentioned by informants. And then when we realize that it might be why they reacted with shock. And then again, when we attempt at repairing the relation with them, provided they have not fled away, of course, or kicked us on the head, by negotiating a plausible account that enlarge, if we are blessed by the God of inquiries, the numbers of templates we are collectively able to entertain with which we can resume future relations. Any one of you, I'm sure, now pictures in your mind those rare and fortunate eureka, either from your own work or from those of your predecessors, that mark the turning points of the value subdiscipline making up the rich domain of anthropology. So ontology emerges in the course of encounter when the inquirer had felt oneself corseted by too narrow a set of legitimate agency, and when he or she is led to bend backward to find a better way to tie back again the relation that had been broken by recognizing another legitimate way of being. In that sense, the exact etymology of such a practice should not be called ontology, but rather deontology, provided you accept to define its etymology in the following way. The exquisite science, or rather the delicate art, of being respectful of those we deal with by being entangled within a set of beings whose status has been fully recognized. Not the science of being as being, but the science, that is, the subtle care of not making mistakes on how many type of agencies are acting on us, as well as on those with whom we try to elaborate a common world. In that sense, ontology and anthropology are almost synonymous. I say almost because, as we shall see, ontology spurs anthropology to resume its original task by pushing it to take a slightly different path. The shift from ontology to deontology will allow me to underline first a few breaches of etiquette in dealing with those we encounter, and then maybe to propose a small protocol to increase the dosage of ontological pluralism. Let me sketch a few of those don't do. The most brutal way of entering into contact would be to start the relation by taking pride in denying the very existence of the agents that are making our informants move. This would be the case, for instance, where we use the category of belief. Belief is the opposite of Midas' touch. It transforms gold into dust. It's almost every time an accusation that establishes an infinite distance between those who study and claim not to believe, and those who are tied by those beliefs in non-existing entity that has to be explained by other realities they are not aware of. Here, the Occam razor becomes a sign. Such a slash and burn strategy has been very efficient in extending the modernizing frontier, but in terms of deontology, it has not taught one thing to the analyst, or rather the conqueror, since the number of templates to account for reality has not been increased by one single item. Simply, the world has been populated with even more ignoramuses that are still clinging to their mistaken and archaic ways until they realize how wrong they are. Although no anthropologist worth salt would indulge in such an asymmetric relation, it might not be unfair to say that many sociologists, especially if they are of a critical mood, will take this type of engagement as the best proof of their scientific status. They would proudly argue that it's only because you don't believe in any of this stuff that you can see through the cloud of illusion through which the actors insist on living. Such a pride in denunciation is probably the remaining distinction between those two disciplines. Ontology for sociologists is a settled matter. They know the list of what make up the world, and their problem is that of providing an explanation using this list. While anthropologists are consumed by deontological scruples, for them, Oliver Cromwell's injunction never ceased to resonate. Beseech you, my brethren, by the power of Christ, bethink that you might be mistaken. While anthropologists accept of running themselves the risk of being mistaken, sociologists prefer leaving this risk safely to the informant. It is because of a gnawing doubt that inquirers attempted a more reasonable way that consists in putting inside brackets any ontological claim by remaining as non-committed as possible about the legitimate reality of the agencies acting upon their informants. This tactic is certainly more polite than to deny a prior pre-existence. But you would agree that it's a strange sort of politeness, since it does nothing but delay indefinitely the moment of reckoning, where both parties will have to negotiate the list of agencies making up their common world. To be sure, the inquirers are no longer conquerors in charge of emptying the world of all the spurious agencies by expanding the modernizing frontier. but they become pretty devious agents doubles, not to say hypocrites, carefully hiding what they really hold to by bluffing their way during their stay in the field and revealing their real attachment only when they are back home with their colleagues. Thanks to this tactic, the Occam razors is still used at home to limit the number of agencies, and if they are allowed to multiply abroad, it's because it makes no real difference, since their claims to existence have been equally denied, so that they all remain suspended in an overcrowded reservation, a sort of ontological limbo. No matter how respectful we have all learned to be in our daily encounters with the other's agencies, it remains that by bracketing out all question of ontology, for perfectly sound scientific reason at first, we have not enlarged our own repertoire of legitimate agencies acting in our world. If they remain active, it's only in theirs. By bracketing out their ontological claim, it's in effect our ontological claim that have been bracketed out as well, or deep frozen if you will. On the whole, such a tactic is less abrasive, but no more deontological than the first. The list of legitimate actants is just as limited as before. The third solution is well known, especially now that it begins to be largely dismantled. It consists not in bracketing out all ontological claims, but on the contrary, in doing as if they had been granted a durable ontological status. The idea this time is to tie their existence to the most enduring and best entrenched organization of reality, namely the gouge known as one nature versus multiple cultures. The solution that now appears retrospectively as the most ethnocentric vision, even though it's supposed to settle for good the question of what is universal and what is particular. With such a template, all the claims of ontology were offered a veneer of reality by being all equally woven out of the same fabric, that of a symbolic world. Whatever other collectives say about the agency that make them act, you no longer have to deny their existence, nor to suspend their access to reality, since you are now allowed to load them with the full weight of their symbolic order. You don't even have to be polite anymore. Now it's science itself that requires you to organize, in whichever way you see fit, the multiplicity of a transformation occurring in what has now gained a reality of its own. And the convenient aspect of this scientific standpoint is that you benefit from the impression that you no longer have to engage in any ontology. While the ways of life of billions of people are sucked into the most provincial format, according to which there is one nature and very many different cultures, you may have the impression that no violence whatsoever has been done to them. You may simultaneously possess all the universality you wish and all the multiplicity you need, without having to negotiate afresh any of the claims about what the common world is made of. So smooth has been the back and forth movement of Occam's razor. With one nature and multiple culture, the much older history of bifurcation, and to use Alfred North Whitehead's label, has completed its course and rendered the search for ontology, it seems, forever a thing of the past. From now on, it will have become impossible. Sorry. One page is missing here. This is a big one. This is Marshall machine as apparently. Oh, no, sorry. Sorry, it's not your fault, Marshall. From now on, you will have to choose either scientific status or ontology. I have it, thank you. See, there is another agency making me speak. Otherness will always be defined according to a symbolic format. As far as nature is concerned, there is no otherness to be considered. We know for good what the world is made of. At this point, meaning and being cannot be rejoined anymore. Case settled. Well, not settled for long. No sooner had ontology been declared dead, it had begun to proliferate anew. What has been called the ontological turn is not a fresh idea, and even less some French idea, but the realization that all the traditional questions tackled by anthropology had been repressed too quickly by the one nature, multiple cultures format. Apparently deep deontological blunders had been made that have rendered vacuous not only the description of cultures, but that of nature as well, thus reopening the line between physical and cultural anthropology. It should not even be called a turn, but rather a return to this deontology that forms the philosophical as well as the political heart of the discipline, but has never been really at ease in the positivistic worldview anyway. Diplomacy and deontology have always accompanied anthropology, and that has nothing to do with an abandonment of the quest for truth. Quite the opposite. With deontology, the requirements for speaking truthfully about the others are increased, because those requirements now have to apply symmetrically to all those who are attempting to compose the common world. For such an encounter, neither the universality of nature nor the multiplicity of culture could do the job. The reasons for this return of ontological scruples are multiple. Post-colonial ethnography first. The vast development of gender studies, of course. The impact of my own field, anthropology of science. And probably more efficaciously than any of those academic moves, the dissemination and thus the dissolution of the various modernizing fronts. There are today so many ways of being modernized that the very distinction between modern and non-modern have been impossible to be made. But I think it's fair to say, above all, that the eruption of ecological mutation has made a mockery of the idea that the list of agencies could be closed. Suddenly this idea seemed ludicrous. And ludicrous also the pretension that we had learned how to address those agencies in the right tone without shocking those they push into action. Any convenient distribution between what is universal and what is multiple is now up for grabs. When Eduardo Vivero de Castro began to speak of multinaturalism, the earth began to tremble. He began to speak of multilateralism while the earth, in parallel, trembled. Is not responsible for the tremor. Such is the situation that we now inherit. With those tremors, older questions have resuscitated. Actually, it would have been amazing that at the time of the Anthropocene, this most unstable of concept, anthropology could emerge unscathed inside its older disciplinary boundaries. Whatever the reason of its return from the dead, it has become simultaneously impossible to close the list of entities making up the common world and to find a shared way to establish the list of entities. This is why I'd like to present a very specific setup where the question raised by such a list could be reopened. I call it an inquiry into modes of existence. The very simple idea is to offer a larger dose of ontological pluralism, or to take up my earlier metaphor, to transform Occam's razor into a cutlery set. The main limitation of the old settlement, what could be called the Object-Subject Operating System, OS for short, was to submit any agency to the same trial by asking, are you an object or a subject? Question which in effect meant, are you real, that is objective, or simply subjective or symbolic? Not surprisingly, each entity thus addressed appears skewed, vague, lame, uncertain of its status, in a word, embarrassed. Although not an anthropologist, it's Whitehead who has best defined the implausible result of such a trial when he wrote, and I'm quoting, "What am I especially protesting against is the bifurcation of nature into two systems of reality, which, insofar as they are real in different senses. One reality would be the entities such as electrons, which are the study of speculative physics. This would be the reality which is there for knowledge, although in this theory it is never known. For what is known is the other sort of reality, which is the byplay of the mind. Thus there would be two natures. One is the conjecture, and the other is the dream." End of quotation. Exactly what happens, as I said at the beginning, when you commit a deontological mistake and fail to detect what is the exact template with which to qualify, to welcome, to house new beings. What would you think of a collective that would offer no other reality to those who make it act than of choosing between conjecture and dream? Yet it's exactly what we are supposed to accept without, as Whitehead said, protestation, when we are told not to indulge in ontology. The reason why we need, it seemed to me, an inquiry into modes of existence is that there is a gross imbalance in how we protest against such an ill-conceived trial. There is much more indignation on the side of a dream than there is on the side of a conjecture. And yet, both have been just as badly treated. That's what I mean by symmetric anthropology. I agree that the whole anthropological literature is a long protestation against such a trial, and a defense of agency bearers against such an ill-adjusted template. To take two recent examples, when Eduardo Cohn tries to reconstruct how forests think, or when Tanya Luhrmann follows what happens when God talks back, they have to make sure that neither forest nor God are drawn into such a courtroom, especially because what they are interested in is how agencies relate to one another, a move that is absolutely forbidden as long as you run the OS operating system. What the return to ontological question allows is for the inquirers to move through what the scholar called interagentivity, a cumbersome word for a clever way to let the agencies free to interpret or to translate one another without having at every step along the way to decline their credential in terms of human intentionality. But what about the other side, that of conjecture? Who is protesting as loudly against the way through which scientific and technical knowledge itself is offended by being asked to pronounce the wrong shibboleth? From the beginning of a program I call An Anthropology of the Modern, I've been struck by this other calamitous consequence of presenting every entity with the same instrument of torture. Are you real or are you subjective? Not only do we risk missing everything that is interesting in the many beings encountered by what is strangely called cultural or social anthropology, we risk not doing justice to what is even more strangely called materiality. And that has been made the other side with which physical anthropology is supposed to be concerned. To be limited to conjecture is no more gratifying than being parked into dream. Am I wrong to think that this is what modernism means? in thinking that this is what has now become unbearable. To continue with the same forest example, when Eduardo Kohn fights so efficiently to establish interagency connection without marking the obligatory stops at the station of the intentional human, he multiplies ontological templates that would be also of great use to understand how, for instance, forest engineer at the INPA in Manaus establish connection with their agencies. Worms, clouds, canopies, finance, bacteria included. As I said earlier, what triggered my interest in anthropology of science and technology, and many of them are here actually today, was not how human, social, political they could be, but on the contrary, how little of the odd types of agencies we could describe by framing them either as material object or as symbolic elaboration. This celebrated OS operating system that was supposed to offer, according to most description, the baseline, the default position, the yardstick, by contrast with which could be defined the rich diversity of cultural ways, does not pay justice to the famous or infamous westernized science, technologies, and economies either. That's what it means to never having been modern. The baseline that was supposed to be so clear-cut that it was used to mark the border in most universities between departments of physical anthropology and their cultural counterpart, renders first materiality incomprehensible. I would even argue that materiality is even less well treated than the symbolic, because we benefit from plenty of magnificent ethnographic accounts, for instance of ritual, but so little description of what it is to be a computer, a termite, an ecosystem, a river catchment, a technical project, or a corporation. Those colonial objects have not been as decolonized as those colonial subjects. While it's a breach of etiquette to frame the questions about Ruina's forest thinking according to the OS operating system, it is just as much a deontological mistake to believe that the science of forestry and soil science would fit nicely in such a frame. In both cases, the one that we no longer call pre-modern and modern, beings and meanings could now be stitched together without having to be broken down through the intervention of a speaking intentional human. It is actually this odd figure, invented in the 17th century, that generates both the conjecture and the dream, and the very idea that there are two sides, that they have bifurcated, or that they should be reconciled. Hence, the necessity of modifying the baseline, the default position, from which I think we still tend to evaluate and gauge all of the entity. In the same way as the trope of an object facing a subject has disappeared, has also disappeared the idea that the science of anthropology was facing its subject matter. All collectives have been thrown into the same pot, striving to decide how to survive with or against one another. This is not the moment to limit too drastically the number of legitimate agencies, since the chance of diplomacy depends on the new configuration that we can establish among those agencies. It's not only from the dream, that we should wake up, but from the conjecture as well. No question is being clarified by giving role to what could be called the OS human operative. The focus of attention should drift toward the trajectories of action, trajectory for which another operating system, it seems to me, is to be devised. And that's where things become really interesting. If humans are pushed gently off stage, it's not because they have been reified, objectified, or naturalized. It's simply that they are traversed by agency that don't have them as their only target, and that don't have them as their origin point. Exactly the move that had been impossible when any flight away from a dream led you immediately to the conjecture and vice versa. This is where lies the crucial new insight. It's not that ethnographers have moved beyond object and subject, or beyond nature and culture, despite the famous title, which would mean along the same gradient, as if by mixing conjecture with dream, you had gained any better access to reality. There is no beyond, but they are lost of before, beneath, elsewhere, up, down, in, and a lot of away and within. In spite of its etymology, there is no reason why anthropology should be anthropocentric. It simply means that the discipline is especially interested in some of the meeting point between those agencies and some of the varying historical figure called humanity. But those figures vary. We have today a good illustration when, because of a new twist in geostory, or geohistory, as Chakrabarty said, former humans, or rather now Terrians, have to learn to present themselves as a geological force. Quite a new guise that you absolutely cannot register as nature, nor as culture, nor as any combination of both. To conclude this lecture, I'm afraid I have to shift from those grandiose and apparently abstruse questions to a very humble, practical, and empirical setup that I imagine to render such a deontology operational. Quite a fall, I'm sorry. During the last quarter of a century, I've attempted quite systematically to increase the numbers of templates by which the so-called modern account for themselves. Not, to be sure, in their official representation, they remain staunch adepts of the OS operating system, and they will swear that they are obedient naturalists. But by looking for the many occasions where they express dissatisfaction with such an official view of themselves, what I think I've documented are, to use Whitehead expression, the protestation by which many different people protest that a skewed template is being used to account for the mode of existence of the agencies that are most attached to them. And the great advantage of never having modern is that those occasions of protestation are not rare events. On the contrary, they are what is visible at every turn. Every time the OS operating system is shown to be wanting, that is, most of the time. Those protestations are especially salient when category mistakes are made. Few examples. For instance, when scientists are asked by politicians to reach a consensus that run against the felicity condition of what they call science, they protest. When politicians are summoned to tell the truth according to a yardstick of transparency and honesty that would make them, in effect, lie according to their own truth condition, they protest, but silently, because politicians are not supposed to even be interested in truth. Even though they have their truth, they don't dare say it. When psychiatrists are requested to choose whether a drug acts biologically or psychologically, dream and conjecture, whereas they feel that the mind-body template is totally ill-adjusted to the task, they protest. When penguins in Lourdes are asked whether they really believe that Bernadette Soubirous has been visited by the real Virgin Mary, and when they shudder and stutter because they want to use the adverb willing, but they feel the meaning implied by the interrogator is not subtle enough. They don't dare protesting. When judges, once the case is settled, are plaintively requested to say whether this is objectively the case, and when they are forced to say, equally plaintively, yes and no, because they are at a loss to calibrate what it means to say in their language for their being what is true legally. They protest. When engineers are requested to state that they master their project completely, when they know full well that the project will be realized only if an entire socio-economic system surrounds the original plan, ecosystem that nonetheless has no room in their plan because of the OS operating system. They protest, and so on and so forth. Well, suppose you are mad enough to do this for a quarter of a century, and always with the same questionnaire. Very important, you have to stabilize the questionnaire. For each of what I call a crossing between modes of existence, each having its own felicity and infelicity condition. Well, step by step, you will end up recognize trajectory, the modes, that play the role of alternative template for the recognition of agencies that have never been at ease in the OS operating system. Then you may begin to say, well, I think there is an alternative to Occam's razor. In the daily life of Westerners, at least, there is a local, very provincial, ontological repertoire that requires, I've not been able to go further, a good dozens of yardsticks. 12 instead of 1. Because don't forget that the object-subject is actually one. It's not two different entities. It's the object of that subject, and it's the subject of that object. So actually there is only one. And I will stop here, because then we go from madness to madness. You go one step further, and you write a book about it that sums up the provisional result of this inquiry. But in another feat of folly, you transform into a digital site. Here, modesofexistence.org. Also a folly because the book is free, so no, difficult to make the publishers understand that. Where you ask readers, transform into co-inquirers, I hope some of you will be, to tell, of course, you how wrong you have been. That's very easy, everyone can do it. And thank you for some of you here who already have done that. Or, this is still a possibility, who accept to join you in negotiating the term by which the former modern, ci-devant modern, could present themselves to the former others, while the pressure of ecological mutation, what I call the eruption of Gaia, is rendering all of their older conflicts, leagues, and associations slightly obsolete. Then you will have deployed in front of the other party at the negotiation table, I'm shifting metaphor here, instead of Occam's razor, a richer cutlery set that might help you to put an end, as Souriau said, to the metaphysical famine from which those who have mandated you, no one has mandated me, but I decided that I was mandated nonetheless, have suffered for long. Well, the chance, of course, of success are nil, but I think it's a good chunk of what the anthropology of modern could be. Thank you very much.
We have about 15 minutes that we can go for discussion and question and answer. If people are here, I'm going to let Bruno just point and call on you. If
So this is a big room, it's difficult. I'm supposed to see the people? You don't want to do that? Because it's complicated for me.
Okay. Raise your hand if you have questions.
Well, maybe I will give a few instructions on the site. Because I need collaborators and co-inquirers. So, sorry? So the book is free. It has exactly the same, it's also interesting as an experiment in academic publishing. It is exactly the same format as the paper book, same layout, same font, same pagination, and you need, which is not the case here, a quick Wi-Fi, I mean fast. You have a book on one of the columns with the chapters, sub-chapter exactly the same thing, and then on the column, the next column, vocabulary, you have a sort of glossary plus index, which is the two function which is made, which is about a third of the book itself, with lots of other explanation. And then on the documentation column there, you have masses, all the former footnotes, but vastly expanded. So you have, for instance, a film by Lucy Schussman. You have lots of things from Vivero de Castro, Descola, Lemonnier, all sorts of things, just sticking to the anthropological literature, which are associated with the text and which don't figure in the book. And the new thing is that the last column is called contribution. The contribution, not commentary, because we are not so interested in commentary that say Latour is a madman, Latour has not read Heidegger, I was in Marshall Sunny's library this morning, okay, I'm in ignorance, but it's no use telling me, I know that. What we are interested is in people bringing in this protestation, I mentioned in the paper, or saying, yes, you might be right on the protestation, but your account of it is rotten, and I have a much better way of doing it. That's what we call contribution. The contribution appears in two lights. The one which are the shadow are the ones that you make for yourself. And when you are interested in sharing them, you send them to a group of live people, my friends and collaborators from different fields, who are editing and helping you make the contribution part of the book. And then, at the end of the project, we actually rewrite part of the book according to the transformation which has been made by the community of co-inquirers. That's what I call diplomatic anthropology. We share the task of producing the inquiry, and of course with the difficulty that it's an inquiry which is highly focused and yet very open, which is a bit of a contradiction, but science is like that. It's a dispositif, it's a highly elaborated setup to get new information. And then we have a whole set of face-to-face meeting with interested people to rewrite part of the book and trying to find something like a way of understanding entities in a way which is shareable, or to say, if you say that of your being, for me that means war. And that at least we establish. So, hello, nice to see you.
Is the network, the deontological space, number one, that we were talking about? Secondly, have there been any results in the online version of the book that is surprising in terms of the collaborative network that you're building and those of it?
So the question was, the first question was about network.
Yes.
Well, it's not a network study, it's a different tag, right?
But
it's compatible.
We want to establish a deontological space. That would be the lower left-hand corner of your writing.
So the question is, did we get any surprising result? Well, we got a lot of surprising results in the face-to-face interaction that we have organized for a year and a half. So far, the contribution is just coming, but it's quite difficult to understand how the site works, even though we like to have built a sort of safe place well with a good font to fill, trying to get out of a click, 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 indefinite openness of the web. We have not yet succeeded very much in getting the right contribution so far. But the contribution is mediated, and it goes in parallel with face-to-face interaction. We're experimenting something which I don't think has ever been done. So we are, of course, at the middle of the project. So it's not a network study. It's compatible with actor network, but it's a different tack. It's trying to re-describe differently. And what we are most interested in is the site where the protestation about the way we understand the beings that count for those who are acted by them is the most pregnant. And where the description, the bricolage description I propose is clearly completed more. And that we had many examples already, and we have actually lots of planned meetings during the whole year of 2014 to rewrite large part of the book. Marsha.
Could you tell us the difference between agent and cause? Agents normally are things that do things for reasons or intentions. But how can you say that of organic things that you call agents?
But the organic thing what?
How can you call the inorganic things agents which have no reasons or intentions?
Oh, that's precisely why agency is much wider than having an intention. First intention is a difficult thing. Here it's a Whitedian argument that agency is the larger term for all sort of trajectory. Some of them have been traditionally seized as causality, which was the first beginning of your question, if I understand. But causality is a very limited way of understanding even causal relations. And we don't forget that the whole symmetric argument is that when we try to oppose intentionality to causality, we treat badly causality as well. So stones are very badly treated when we treat them as being causal. It doesn't mean that they have intentionality. It means that they have all sorts of different modes of existence. One of them, very important, the one that has been extracted, I think, by Whitehead, called in this project reproduction, which has nothing to do with causality either. And the great bifurcation of nature, causality is a term of a conjecture. But if you now talk with geologists, causality will not be the way to house safely and comfortably stones. So stones are as badly housed into causality as many other things which the naturalization of human culture has done. That's my point, is that we should be symmetric on both sides, conjecture and dream. But that's of course the Whitedian movement here. But for that you need a mode of existence which is original, which is not to be confused with nature, which is not to be confused with causality, which is, here it's called reproduction. Without talking?
How do you negotiate without recognition of intentionality?
I wanted to know how you have a negotiation which isn't involving human intentionality.
But intentionality is extended in this argument to a lot of other things than human. I mean, intentionality is not a property of human. Intentionality is a general cosmic character. I mean, everything endures, to use Whitehead term. Enduring is a very pretty powerful form of intentionality. This thing has a pretty strong intentionality. It lasts. Lasting is a pretty important intentionality.
What are the conditions of practice?
Now that's a good question. Well, that's when things become interesting, is when there is a protestation about it. So we had this discussion in one of the mood here, with physicists the other day, because of course the interesting is to talk with physicists about that. And the place where you hear the protestation is when they say, well, in principle we could calculate, but in practice we cannot. And I say that's really interesting, because to be able to do something in principle but not in practice means that you are framing your experience of physics as physicists in the conjecture metaphysics. Okay, now let's try another one. Let's try a way to grant its own mode of existence to, for instance, things which is usually called by physicists force. Of course, force have no intentionality in the sense of penguin or trout, but we don't need that. We just need you to get away slightly when you say, I'm here in principle but not in reality. It means something else is inserted into your argument, and that is something else, which is a protestation. So the negotiation, this is a good question, the negotiation is impossible if there is no protestation of experience which is articulated here. And that's what we try to gather, crossing after crossing. Every time there is a protestation when a practitioner says, I'm not at ease here because I have to use two different templates, the task is to say, well, maybe if you are not at ease, it's because another template might be better fit here. What if you would accept the difference between reproduction and reference? Causality is a term of reference. Causality is what reference means, because it maintains a constant throughout a series of transformations. Would you accept that? And then the physicists say, no. If you ask me to do that, I'm no longer a physicist. And he said, in my tribe, this means being put to death. I say, fine. Here we have a nice borderline. It's diplomatic, it's perfectly understandable. Here you understand, if you ask me to do this for physicists, I die. But then the biologists who were there see no problem with the argument, because their point is to get out of a strange sociology which has been imported in biology under the name of organism. So they are very interested in finding other modes of existence for organism than the traditional sort of sociology we have imported. Most of biology is actually importing models from social sciences. So this is why the negotiation has to be very carefully delineated. It's slow, it takes time, but I think it's very interesting.
Other questions? Okay, well then I'd like to thank Professor Latour for being the distinguished lecturer.